The heart monitor's steady beeping filled the sterile room as 35-year-old Richard Blackstone lay dying in his hospital bed. With less than 24 hours to live according to the doctors, this man who had built a fortune worth $300 million had one final request that would shock everyone in that room. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the smallest acts of human kindness can create miracles that medical science cannot explain. Dear God, we ask for your blessings upon everyone watching this story today. May it touch their hearts and remind them of the power of love, compassion, and human connection. May each viewer find inspiration and hope in what they're about to witness. Amen. Before we dive into this incredible story, I want you to do something for me. In the comments below, tell me where you're watching this from right now. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because stories like this one deserve to be shared with the world. Richard Blackstone wasn't always the cold, isolated man lying in that hospital bed. Just 15 years earlier, at the age of 20, he had been a completely different person. He had been married to Sarah, his high school sweetheart and the love of his life. They were young, ambitious, and had endless dreams of building a future together. Sarah was studying to become a teacher, while Richard was starting his first business venture, a small tech company he ran from their tiny apartment. But those dreams were shattered when Sarah died in a car accident at the age of 22, leaving 23-year-old Richard broken and completely alone. The grief was so overwhelming that it felt like drowning in an ocean of pain. Sarah had been his everything, his best friend, his partner, his reason for getting up every morning. Without her, the world became colorless and empty. For 12 years after Sarah's death, Richard had lived behind walls of money and power. The small tech company he had started became his obsession, his way of escaping the crushing loneliness that threatened to destroy him. He worked 18-hour days, made ruthless business decisions, and built an empire that included real estate, technology companies, and investment firms. Every deal was bigger than the last, every acquisition more aggressive. Money became his armor against feeling anything at all. By 35, Richard owned mansions he never stayed in, luxury cars that sat unused in climate-controlled garages, and had bank accounts that grew larger while his heart grew colder. He had employees, not friends, business associates, not family. He had surrounded himself with people who wanted something from him, but no one who actually cared about him as a human being. Richard had become a master at pushing people away before they could get close enough to hurt him. His business reputation was legendary, brilliant, ruthless, and completely unforgiving. He had convinced himself that emotional detachment was strength, that needing no one made him invincible. But lying in that hospital bed with his heart failing, Richard faced the bitter reality that all his wealth meant nothing. No amount of money could buy him more time. No influence could change his fate. For the first time in 12 years, Richard Blackstone was completely powerless. The diagnosis had come as a shock just 1 week earlier. What he thought was exhaustion from another 80-hour work week turned out to be severe heart failure. The doctors explained that years of stress, poor eating habits, lack of sleep, and emotional isolation had literally broken his heart. At 35, his cardiovascular system was failing like that of a man twice his age. That's when she walked into his room. Grace Williams was a 28-year-old nurse who had been working at St. Mary's Hospital for 6 years. Despite her young age, she had already earned a reputation among the staff for her exceptional ability to connect with even the most difficult patients. Grace had grown up in a family where love was expressed through service to others. Her grandmother had been a nurse, her mother volunteered at homeless shelters, and Grace had always known that she wanted to dedicate her life to caring for people during their most vulnerable moments. Grace had an unusual gift for seeing past the surface of her patients. She could look beyond their anger, fear, or pain, and recognize the human need that lay beneath. It was a skill that had served her well in the cardiac unit, where people often arrived facing their own mortality for the first time. When Grace first entered Richard's room to check his vitals at the start of her night shift, she immediately sensed that this patient was different from the others. The medical chart painted a picture of a wealthy, difficult man who had been making unreasonable demands and treating the staff poorly. But Grace saw something else entirely. She saw pain in his eyes that had nothing to do with his failing heart. It was the kind of deep, soul-crushing pain that came from years of self-imposed isolation. Richard was initially hostile to Grace, just as he had been to everyone else. He barked orders about the temperature of his room, complained about the quality of the hospital food, and made cutting remarks about the competence of the medical staff. His tone was dismissive and cold, the same voice he used in boardrooms to intimidate competitors and employees. But Grace responded differently than the others. She didn't become defensive or match his hostile energy. Instead, she looked him directly in the eyes and said quietly, "You must be exhausted. It takes a lot of energy to be angry all the time." Her words caught Richard completely off guard. No one had spoken to him with such gentle directness in years. Something in her tone, not judgmental, not patronizing, just genuinely compassionate, caused the first crack to appear in the walls Richard had spent 12 years building. When he tried to maintain his harsh demeanor, complaining about the uncomfortable bed and demanding better accommodations, Grace didn't argue or make excuses. Instead, she pulled up a chair next to his bed and said, "Tell me about the most comfortable place you've ever slept." The question was so unexpected and personal that Richard found himself actually considering it. After a long pause, he found himself describing the old farmhouse where he and Sarah had spent their honeymoon. He told Grace about the antique four-poster bed with the handmade quilt, about how they had spent lazy Sunday mornings there talking about their dreams for the future. As he spoke, his voice began to soften, and tears he hadn't shed in over a decade started to form in his eyes. Grace listened without interruption, without trying to fix anything or offer platitudes. She simply sat there and allowed this broken man to remember what it felt like to have someone genuinely care about his thoughts and feelings. When Richard's voice cracked as he described how empty his life had become after losing Sarah, Grace reached out and gently placed her hand over his. That simple touch, the first genuine human connection Richard had experienced in 12 years, broke something open inside him that he thought had died with Sarah. He began to sob, more than a decade of suppressed grief pouring out of him like water through a broken dam. The successful businessman, the ruthless negotiator, the man who prided himself on never showing weakness, wept like a lost child. Grace didn't pull away or try to stop his tears. She didn't offer empty words about everything being okay. She simply sat there, her hand on his, letting him feel the warmth of human compassion for the first time since Sarah's funeral. When his tears finally subsided, she handed him tissues and said softly, "Sarah must have been very special." Over the next several hours, as Richard's condition continued to deteriorate according to the medical readings, something beautiful began to happen between him and Grace. She would check on him more frequently than her other patients, not because he required more medical attention, but because she could see how desperately he needed human connection. During these visits, Richard began to open up about his life in ways he hadn't done with anyone since Sarah's death. He told Grace about the children's hospital wing he had anonymously funded, explaining that Sarah had always loved kids and they had planned to have 3 children together. He talked about the scholarship program he had quietly established for underprivileged students, something no one in his business circles knew about because he had done it in Sarah's name without any publicity. Grace began to realize that beneath the harsh exterior was a man who had actually spent years trying to honor his late wife's memory through acts of generosity, even while punishing himself with isolation. The Richard she was getting to know was nothing like the cold businessman the world saw. He was sensitive, thoughtful, and carried a burden of guilt that had been slowly killing him for over a decade. "I should have been driving that night," Richard confessed to Grace during one of their late-night conversations. "Sarah wanted to stay in and watch movies, but I insisted we go to that business dinner. If I had just listened to her, if I had put her needs before my ambitions just that once, she'd still be alive." Grace's heart ached for this man who had been carrying such unnecessary guilt for so long. "Richard," she said gently, "accidents are called accidents because no one plans them. Sarah chose to get in that car because she loved you and wanted to support your dreams. Punishing yourself for 12 years hasn't honored her memory. It's wasted the life she would have wanted you to live." As the night wore on and the doctors grew increasingly concerned about Richard's declining vital signs, he made another confession that revealed the depth of his transformation. "Grace, I need you to know something. These past few hours with you have been the first time I've felt truly alive since Sarah died. I had convinced myself that feeling nothing was better than feeling pain. But I was wrong. I've been dead inside for 12 years, and somehow you've reminded me what it feels like to be human again." It was then, with less than 6 hours left to live according to the medical team, that Richard made his final request. With tears streaming down his face, he looked into Grace's compassionate eyes and said, "I know this might sound inappropriate, and I know I have no right to ask this of you, but you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. You've helped me remember how to feel, how to hope, how to believe that goodness still exists in this world. If I'm going to die today, could I ask for one last kindness? Could you give a foolish man who's finally learned how to live again a goodbye kiss?" The request hung in the air between them, vulnerable and heartbreaking. This wasn't the demand of an entitled rich man or an inappropriate advance. It was the desperate plea of a human being who was finally allowing himself to feel love again, even though it seemed too late. Grace looked at this transformed man who had rediscovered his humanity in his final hours. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that sometimes the greatest gift a nurse could give wasn't medicine or medical procedures, but simple human compassion. Without hesitation, she leaned down and gently kissed his forehead, whispering, "You're not foolish, Richard. You're brave. It takes courage to open your heart again." But then something extraordinary happened that would change both their lives forever. As Grace's lips touched Richard's forehead, his eyes closed, and the most peaceful smile she had ever seen spread across his face. The heart monitor that had been showing increasingly dangerous irregularities suddenly began to stabilize. His breathing, which had been labored and shallow, became deeper and more regular. The machines tracking his vital signs started showing improvements that the medical staff couldn't explain. Dr. Martinez, Richard's attending physician, rushed into the room when the monitoring system showed the dramatic changes. He was a seasoned cardiologist who had seen thousands of cardiac patients, but he had never witnessed anything like what was happening to Richard Blackstone. Every test he ran contradicted what should have been happening to a man in end-stage heart failure. Richard's heart function had improved dramatically overnight. His blood pressure stabilized, his oxygen levels increased, and his cardiac rhythm became strong and regular. Dr. Martinez consulted with colleagues, ordered additional tests, and even brought in specialists from other hospitals. But no one could provide a medical explanation for Richard's recovery. The most dramatic change, however, wasn't in Richard's physical condition. It was in the man himself. The bitter, angry millionaire who had entered the hospital seemed to have been replaced by someone entirely different. Richard spent the next week in the hospital, not because his condition was deteriorating, but because the doctors wanted to monitor his miraculous recovery and ensure it was sustainable. During those days, Richard and Grace spent hours talking whenever she wasn't busy with other patients. Richard learned about Grace's life, her dreams of eventually becoming a nurse practitioner so she could help more people. and her unwavering faith in the power of human connection. Grace learned more about the real Richard, the man who had buried his capacity for love under layers of grief and guilt, but who was now experiencing a kind of emotional rebirth. Richard told Grace about his plans to restructure his business empire, to create companies that focused on helping people rather than just generating profit. He talked about his desire to establish programs for young widows and widowers, having realized how desperately he had needed support during his own darkest period, but had been too proud to seek it. When Richard was finally discharged from the hospital with a completely clean bill of health that astounded his entire medical team, he didn't return to his empty penthouse or his sterile office building. Instead, he spent the next several months liquidating most of his assets and using the proceeds to establish the Sarah Grace Foundation, named after his late wife and the nurse who had literally saved his life through an act of pure compassion. The foundation focused on providing comprehensive support for people facing end-of-life care, grief counseling for young widows and widowers, and programs that connected isolated individuals with compassionate communities. Richard personally oversaw every aspect of the foundation, using his business skills not to accumulate wealth, but to maximize the positive impact they could have on people's lives. 9 months after his miraculous recovery, Richard asked Grace to dinner. Not as a patient grateful to his nurse, but as a man who had fallen in love with a woman who embodied everything beautiful about humanity. Grace, who had watched Richard's genuine transformation from broken businessman to compassionate human being, accepted. Their courtship was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. Richard approached love differently this time, not with the desperate need of his youth, but with the grateful appreciation of someone who understood how precious and fragile connection could be. Grace fell in love not with Richard's wealth or success, but with his newly opened heart and his commitment to using his second chance at life to help others. 18 months after Richard's near-death experience, he and Grace were married in a beautiful ceremony, held in the chapel of St. Mary's Hospital, where they had first met. Instead of an expensive reception, they hosted a celebration for the patients and families served by the Sarah Grace Foundation. Richard's wedding vow brought tears to everyone present. "Grace, you taught me that love isn't something to be afraid of losing, but something to be grateful for sharing. You showed me that a heart can be broken and still continue to beat, that a life can seem over and still have its most beautiful chapters ahead. I promise to love you with the full knowledge that nothing is guaranteed, and that makes every moment we have together infinitely more precious." Today, 3 years later, Richard and Grace continue to run the foundation together, while building a life filled with the kind of simple joys Richard had forgotten existed. They travel together, not to luxury resorts, but to visit foundation sites and the people whose lives have been transformed by their work. They host dinner parties in their modest home, not for business contacts, but for the friends they've made through their shared mission of service. Richard often tells people that he lived for 35 years, but only truly began living in his final 24 hours, when he learned that opening your heart to love again doesn't guarantee you won't be hurt, but it guarantees you won't miss out on the beauty that makes life worth living. The doctors still can't explain his miraculous recovery, but Richard and Grace know that some healings happen not through medical intervention, but through the power of human love and the courage to be vulnerable. The story of Richard and Grace reminds us that it's never too late to change, never too late to love, and never too late to discover that the most powerful healing force in the universe isn't found in any medicine or procedure, but in the simple act of one human being showing another that they are seen, valued, and worthy of love. Richard's last wish wasn't really for a kiss from a nurse. His last wish was to feel human again, to remember what it was like to connect with another soul, to experience love without the paralyzing fear that had kept him isolated for over a decade. Grace's gift to him wasn't just that gentle kiss on his forehead, but her willingness to see past his walls and recognize the wounded heart that was ready to heal. Sometimes miracles happen in operating rooms with cutting-edge technology and brilliant surgeons, but sometimes they happen in quiet hospital rooms when one person shows another that they are not alone, that their life has meaning, and that love is always worth the risk of loss. If this story touched your heart today, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Share your thoughts about second chances, about the people who've helped you heal, or about times when you've been someone else's source of hope. And don't forget to subscribe so we can continue sharing stories that remind us of what truly matters in this world, the connections we make, and the love we share along the way.